Morning, we're going to begin today by recognizing who we are here to worship. So I'm going to ask you, Christian, in whom do you believe? And you'll respond by reading the Apostles' Creed. So we'll say that together. Christian, in whom do you believe?
I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. He was conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary. He suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and buried. He descended into hell. On the third day he rose again. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of God. He will come again to judge the living and the dead. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the holy Christian Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the everlasting. Amen.
Well, good morning. I'm Chaplain Armstrong, one of the pastoral team here, and I'm glad to be worshiping with you virtually today. I hope that we can just lift our hearts up to the Lord. Let's do that now as we ask him to join us here and wherever you are as well. So please pray with me. Almighty Father, you know precisely how we are dealing with this crisis around us. You are precisely the one we need to fix our hearts aright. God, be with us this morning, that we would be able to set our hearts on you, to open our hearts to you, God, to know you better. We ask that in Jesus' name. Well, before we go on and have our first song of the day, I do want to give you a heads up. Next week, we do have Mother's Day. So this is your big warning. Go ahead, get that card, figure it out, and send it. Care for your mothers, especially during this time. Their hearts are breaking more than yours are. So go ahead, be prepared. There's your big announcement for today. Until then, let's continue on in our worship with singing our hymn. Come on up.
Good morning. It's great to be in the house of the Lord.
Amen.
Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. Heir of salvation, purchase of God, born of his spirit, washed in his blood. This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Savior all the day long. Please join us in singing Blessed Assurance. 3 verses.
Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. Heir of salvation, purchase of God, born of his spirit, washed in his blood. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Perfect submission, always at rest. I am my Savior and happy and blessed. Watching and waiting, looking above, filled with His goodness, lost in His love. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all day long.
We're going to take some time now to lift up all our concerns, our worries before the Lord, to cast them on Jesus because He cares for us. Please pray with me now, and we'll conclude by saying the Lord's Prayer. We come to you again, Father, so grateful for your many blessings, which our eyes are sometimes slow to see because we're so busy looking at our troubles. But God, nothing is trouble for you. You've carried all our troubles already and overcome them in your resurrection. Lord, help us to carry to you everything that we are concerned about and find in you complete rest. We ask this not for ourselves only, Lord. We ask that you'd be with the church around the world this morning, the different and difficult ways she is finding to gather, especially those who are persecuted, Lord. We ask that you would grant them peace, grant them moments where they may sing your songs without fear. Lord, we ask that you would take care of all those who are suffering from this virus that is spread among us. Lord, people we know and those we don't. We do ask that you would just make your presence here among us now and among your church where she is spread out. May your presence ripple out into blessing throughout this world until all is taken care of. We look forward to that in the last day, Lord, but now may we see signs of it here on earth as it is in heaven. God, we ask that you would be with our families, be with our friends, be with our local government, be with our state governments, be with us here on Fort Rucker, and all our chain of command. Lord, we do ask that you would be with our national government as well, particularly our president, Lord. We ask that you would guide President Trump into all wisdom and righteousness. We ask this knowing, God, that you have given all government to your Son, who reigns as our King. We ask that you would guide us all to follow him, even as we follow him now by saying his very words. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Good morning. Glad you could tune in for our service. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a storm I went through in the summer of '08. At the time, I and my family were living in Louisville, Kentucky,
And there was a humongous storm that ripped through that state. Came with a bunch of tornadoes. It was a pretty terrible storm. So it started on a Sunday afternoon. Me and my family, we had just had church, and we were over at some friend's house, some church members, kind of fellowshipping and having lunch. And we noticed the wind was picking up. It was getting darker and darker. And eventually we said, maybe we should get home. So under normal circumstances, it would have taken us about half an hour to drive to our home from where we were. But these were not normal circumstances. As we were going through Louisville, we found out that the beautiful trees and the foliage in that city had a downside. That a lot of limbs and trees had fallen down. A lot of roads were blocked off and impassable. A lot of those limbs had actually brought down power lines. It was a fascinating trip back home. We saw, as we drove by Transformers, sparks flying out of them. It was a little crazy. So then we finally arrived at our rented house, and we saw that a neighbor's tree had fallen the roof of the house, putting a big hole in the roof. So I was concerned about my dog, my hound dog, because she was home, Harley. So I went inside and I called for her, and she did not come. And that had never happened before. She always comes. She's a very loyal, very obedient dog. I'd had her for 10 years, rescued her when I was living in Florida. So I thought maybe she'd get out and somehow in the storm. So I was thinking maybe looking at the neighborhood. But eventually, our daughter Emily found her hiding under her brother's Wyatt's bed. She was frightened. She'd never been frightened of storms before, but this storm was something different. A tree had fallen through the house. So she was hiding under that bed, and I could not get her. It took me a while to coax her from getting out from under that bed, because this storm was so severe, it shook her faith in my ability to protect her. So today we're going to look at a storm in the New Testament, in God's Word. And we're going to see a storm that was so terrifying, it shook the disciples' faith in their Lord to protect them, as Harley did with me. So if you will, turn in your Bibles to the book of Mark, and Mark chapter 4. It's just a short passage today. We're going to look at Mark 4, verses 35 through 41. Mark 4, verses 35 through 41. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so the boat was already full. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear, and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" So in verses 35 to 38, we see the toss of Galilee. We learn from these verses that following Christ will not prevent us from having earthly sorrows and troubles. Now, a word of explanation about the Sea of Galilee. It's actually a lake, a small body of water and basin, surrounded by small mountains. And due to the geography of the area, it is prone for very sudden, very violent storms. There's the cool air over the Mediterranean Sea, and it comes up through the Jordan River Valley, and then once it hits that hot, humid air over the Sea of Galilee, it can create these violent storms very suddenly, very abruptly. And that's apparently what happened as Jesus and his disciples were crossing the Sea of Galilee in their fishing boats. We see that storms and calamities do befall Christ's followers. And we have something today called the prosperity gospel, and they preach that if you have enough faith, storms won't befall you, that everything will be smooth sailing. But they are feeding us a diet of pure sugar. Don't listen to them. Look at the apostles. All the apostles died martyrs' deaths, with the exception of the apostle John. Jesus himself in Matthew 16:24, he said, "If you want to follow me, then you need to take up your cross and follow me." And when he was talking about crosses, he was talking about jewelry. He was talking about an instrument of torture, and execution. So he says our lives will be full of trials, losses, and crosses. And this is exemplified in times of war when casualties are high and we are well acquainted with death. I remember when I was going through chaplain school in Fort Jackson, the instructors were very adamant that we needed to have a theology of suffering before we graduated and before we went downrange to Iraq or Afghanistan. Have a theology of suffering, because they're afraid that chaplains could possibly lose their faith when they encounter things that they have never encountered before. And unfortunately, that has happened to a few chaplains. We also see suffering multiply when there's a pandemic, such as the COVID-19 virus that we find ourselves in right now. Lynn Anderson had it right all those years ago when she sang, "I beg your pardon, I never promised you a rose garden." Believers, even strong believers, often find themselves in adverse circumstances. We could look at Job and his losses. We could look at David and how he was pursued by King Saul. We could look at Elijah and how the queen Jezebel tried to assassinate him, and on and on. So believers do face adverse circumstances. The good news is the Lord uses these trials for our sanctification, to make us more like him. Jesus' apostles and his followers, they learned and they grew from what they went through, and they became great, strong Christians. We can look at James chapter 1, verse 2 through 4. It tells us how God uses this in our sanctification. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 says, "Count it all joy, my brothers." Easier said than done, but yet we are commanded to count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. It's the wars, it's the battles that turn soldiers into warriors. It's the fire that refines and purifies gold. It's the winter that makes it easy to distinguish the coniferous trees from the deciduous trees, the evergreens from the other trees. Be encouraged by the promise found in Philippians chapter 1, verse 6. The Apostle Paul writes, "And I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ." So take comfort in the fact that God is working in us, and he has promised that he will complete, he will finish that work in us. But I want you to note something else in these verses, back in Mark chapter 4, verse 38. I'll talk a little bit about theology. So, chapter 4, verse 38 says, "But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion." Talking about Jesus. So, historians and archaeologists, they tell us this cushion under the coxswain seat was probably a sandbag that was used for ballast. So, Jesus apparently, he was tired after teaching all day. And he's in the rear stern of the vessel, and he said, "I'm taking a nap." And so he took a nap. And that shows us the humanity of Christ. The Gospel of Mark often reveals the humanity of Christ. He gives us little tidbits like that. It's a small detail, but it shows that Jesus is very human. The Bible teaches that Christ was born. He ate, he slept, he cried, he felt pain, and he died. It doesn't get more human than that. Historically, we could look at cultish groups, and they tried to deny the humanity of Jesus. They have posited that he was a spirit who just appeared human. And people have believed this because of the influence of Platonic philosophy. Platonic philosophy, the philosophy of Plato, teaching that the material matter is bad, but the spirit is perfect and good. But this is not what the Bible teaches. It's contrary to that. We remember that God created man. We remember that Jesus in the incarnation took on flesh. The second person of the Trinity, God, took on flesh and added humanity to his divinity. And our hope is that we will have resurrected bodies as well. God cares about the material world. Jesus' humanity is important, which is why the old statements of faith, the Apostles' Creed, and the Nicene Creed emphasize the humanity of Christ. When we read these, like we just did, it talks about Jesus being born of the Virgin Mary. It talks about his death. Only a human could be born. Only a human could die. If Christ wasn't fully human, that's really important, because if he wasn't fully human, then he could not be our substitute. He could not represent mankind on the cross when he died to pay the penalty for our sins. So that's why it's very important. We would not be able to stand before God's righteous judgment without Jesus being fully human. We'd be condemned. Also, there's a pastoral value in knowing that Jesus was God too. Hebrews 4:14 through 15, one of my favorite passages, declares, "Since we then have a high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin." That Hebrews passage tells us that we don't have some God who is so far and so distant. He is transcendent, but he's also immanent. That means he's close. When we go to God in prayer, we can pray boldly, because we know that the Son of God lived on this earth for 33 years. He knows what it's like to be tempted. He knows what it's like to struggle. He can sympathize and empathize with our weaknesses. He understands us. So we see first the toss of Galilee. Secondly, I want to look at the loss of serenity in the latter part of verse 38. The last half of 38 is, "They woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?'" And we learn from this that true Christians do display doubts and fears, weaknesses at times. Now, it's a little ironic in this passage, because remember, most of the disciples are mariners, they're fishermen. And Jesus is the landlord, right? He's the carpenter. So in this storm, he's fast asleep. And the mariners, once they see these waves coming over the vessel, they're afraid. They're like, "This is a really bad storm. We haven't seen anything like this before." So like, "Jesus, don't you care that we're all going to die? We're going to drown?" The disciples lacked faith. They misinterpreted Jesus sleeping as apathy. They interpreted it as indifference. And we often do the same thing. Well, we're in trouble. Where is God? Doesn't he care? You see that David says stuff like that in the Psalms. Doesn't he care? Is he apathetic? But Jesus Christ is not indifferent. He's the creator of the world. He created the Sea of Galilee. He knows that he's not going to be harmed, and those with him are not going to be harmed until the appointed time. But like my dog Harley, the circumstances momentarily cause the disciples to lose faith in their Lord. Fortunately, the good news is the Lord is patient with weak believers. God may discipline and reprove us sometimes when our faith is lacking, but he'll never leave us. In Matthew 12:20, Jesus quotes Isaiah, and he says, and I think we often neglect this verse, it's a really, I think, important verse. He says that he will not break a bruised reed or quench a smoldering wick. What does that mean? He's talking about his followers. And he says, if you're a bruised reed, I'm not going to break you. If you're a smoldering wick, I'm not going to snuff you out. I'm not going to crush you when your faith is lacking. I understand that sometimes faith flounders. That's what that verse is telling us. Aren't you glad that he understands our weaknesses? Aren't you thankful for his compassion? I know that he's been patient with me in times when I was going through difficult circumstances and I doubted his goodness. It's interesting when you look at Hebrews 11, that great hall of faith, and all these Christians that we are believers that we read about in our Bibles. And we see Abraham and Noah and Moses and all these guys. And it just lists their great moments of faith. It doesn't list their sins. You read, oh, Abraham, I know there's times he lacked faith. It doesn't talk about that in Hebrews chapter 11. Because their sins are removed. Their mistakes are as far as the east is from the west. God just focuses on their acts of faith. If only we could be so forgiving of others, to look at the things they did well, not the things that they failed to. The Presbyterian theologian, Sinclair Ferguson, says, the weakest faith gets the same strong Christ as does the strongest faith. I think that's worth repeating. The weakest faith gets the same strong Christ as the strongest faith. That's good to know. So we've looked at the toss of Galilee, the loss of serenity. Finally, we're going to look at the boss of the stormy sea in verses 39 through 41. So after his followers wake up, Jesus commands the storm to stop. We see in verse 39, he says, he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Now this miracle that Jesus did, instantly stopping the storm, demonstrates his power. He's not just the Lord of the church. He's the Lord of all creation. He's the Lord of every creature, for he is fully divine. You know, his critics and skeptics, you can read them sometimes, see them on TV or read about them in articles, and they try to explain away Jesus' miracles because they have an anti-supernaturalistic bias. That's supernatural. Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. But they have this bias because it's supernatural. And they say, well, you know, this actually is, they try to explain it with medical reasoning, they try to explain things with science or psychology. This is what really happened. We know miracles don't happen, so this is what really happened. Well, then we have this miracle. Explain that one. Jesus said, "Hey, storm, cut it out." And it stops immediately. Can't be explained away. Ultimately, the scientific method can only judge things that are measurable and replicable. So you can't use the scientific method to judge miracles because it's not replicable. Only God can repeat things, miracles that is, and it's certainly not measurable. So that's science overstepping its boundaries. But Jesus is God. After he calms the storm, he says to his disciples, "I find the lack of your faith disturbing." No, that was Darth Vader. But he does say something very similar. He says, "Hey, why are you so filled with fear? Why is your faith lacking?" Then what happens? This is very interesting. Look at verse 41. This is really the main point of this passage. It kind of ends on this open rhetorical note. They were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him?" They become, after the storm is calmed by Jesus, they become more afraid of Jesus than they were of the storm. They're like, who is he? They understood he was the Messiah. They understood he was a great prophet that was prophesied in the Old Covenant. But they really were just beginning to understand that more than that, he's God. He's deity. Like, who is this? To command the storm. Returning to the Nicene Creed, it came out of the Arian controversy. The Arians were the heretics who, in the 4th century, they denied the full deity of Christ. So in 325, the early church met, and in writing, they affirmed Jesus is 100% God and 100% man. See, they weren't able to meet because of the Roman persecutions, but Constantine became a Christian, and he ended those Roman persecutions for a time, and so they're able to meet and write these things down in Nicaea, present-day Turkey. And they declared that, which is helpful for us to remember, that the fact that Jesus is human and God is foundational to our beliefs as Christians. It's a foundational doctrine. If we don't believe that, then we're not Christians. You know, some cults have claimed that the Son of God gave up his deity while on the earth. Others say that he's a man who achieved his deity. Now, we don't run into a lot of that today, a little bit, but the common belief of our secular society just totally denies his deity. They say, well, you know, Jesus was a good man. I respect that. But God, I don't think so. They don't have an issue with his humanity. They have an issue with his divinity. Because, again, we live in a very anti-supernaturalistic society. However, the Bible teaches that Jesus is fully God and fully human. We see just in this passage that Jesus needed to rest. He was tired, but he also commanded creation. Jesus pre-existed the second person of the Trinity in eternity before he was born in Bethlehem by the Virgin Mary. He did not take anything away from his deity in the incarnation. What he did is he added humanity to his deity. It's what the bishops at Nicaea called the hypostatic union. And you might also see on TV or read some article that says that's a late invention of the church. Early Christians, people who knew Christ, they didn't believe he was God. That's what they'll say. Well, here's some news for you. Mark was written within a decade of Christ's death and resurrection and ascension. It's the earliest book of the New Testament. And that's just not my opinion. That's the opinion of pretty much all New Testament scholars. It's science. But what does this mean for us? It means that this holy and powerful God loves us. And he can rescue, he can save us from our just deserts in hell if we believe in him. Also, not only can he save us from the penalty of sin, he can save us from our most desperate moments, our severest storms. However, it would be a mistake to conclude from this text that God always intervenes in such a manner that he'll immediately come in and take away all of our calamities. Sometimes that is the case. Thank God for that. But sometimes it is not the case. And after that storm in Louisville, back when I couldn't find my hound dog, we had to endure a week with no power. So that was not the end of the problem. And then, me and the landlord had to patch up the roof too. 6 months later, in the height of winter, we had an ice storm, and we lost power for a week again. And that was much worse than in the summer, because we had no heat for a week. So we do go through those calamities. We don't have instant answers sometimes to our problems. Sometimes God immediately intervenes and removes those things from our lives, but often he chooses to work through the trials. It's not always going to be smooth sailing, but we can take heart knowing that Jesus is in the boat with us, that he is in the storm. It's easy to have faith when all is well, but it can suddenly turn to hell. However, our strong Christ has promised to go with us through all these storms. Remember Psalm 23. I'm not going to fear, because this shepherd is with me. I can walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I'll fear no evil, because your rod and your staff, they comfort me. I know you will lead me by streams of living water to prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Take comfort in that. Jesus is bigger. He's more than equal to any threat, to any problem, to any virus that we face. Life is full of hazards and temptations, but Jesus will help us persevere through them. And he will make us better people by going through those things. He will sanctify us. And he will turn our fear into faith, as he did for those disciples. After all they went through, they became very bold missionaries, traveling all over the world, proclaiming the good news of Christ. I'd like to finish with a passage from 2 Corinthians chapter 4. The Apostle Paul writes about having the gospel, the good news of Christ, inside these weak vessels, what he calls jars of clay. Take comfort from these verses. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 through 9. It says, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not driven to despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed." Let's pray. God the Father, Son, and Spirit, thank you that you are our God. We thank you that you are powerful. We thank you that Jesus was incarnated, is incarnated, and that he sympathizes, that he is our mediator between us and the Almighty. We know that we can boldly pray, that you empathize with our plight, that you are not distant, that you are near, you are close, you are with us, that you are present. And I just ask, we ask, that you will give that assurance, you will give that peace that passes all understanding to all who are afflicted, to all who are suffering at this present time. In Jesus' name we pray.
But Fort Rucker is more than a trading installation. It is also a place where thousands of people live their daily lives. It's a pleasant, self-sufficient place, providing almost all of the needs of a modern community. There are places of worship and